A balcony. It was not announced from a balcony. It was not whispered through a court circular. It began with a signature King Charles's hand moving across a confidential document inside the palace machine, while Queen Camilla's future quietly shifted beneath her feet. Reports suggest even senior aides were caught off guard. And by nightfall, one question was echoing through the royal corridors. What had Charles just signed? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. According to Palace Whispers, the document was not written like a public scandal. There was no dramatic statement, no formal rebuke, no thunderous announcement from Buckingham Palace. That was what made it more chilling. It moved quietly, through the private language of monarchy. Household arrangements, future access, residence expectations, post-reign protections, and the delicate boundaries that separate personal loyalty from royal authority. Insiders suggest it concerned Queen Camilla's place after Charles's reign, a subject so sensitive that even the most experienced courtiers reportedly treated it like a sealed chamber. Because when a reigning king is facing serious health concerns, every quiet decision begins to sound like succession planning. For Camilla's closest allies, the timing was said to be devastating. They had expected reassurance. They had expected a reaffirmation of her dignity, her standing, her security. After all, when she had walked beside Charles through the long road from scandal to crown, from whispered judgment to the sunlit ceremony of coronation. But reports suggest this document did not offer expansion. It offered limits. Not punishment, perhaps, but protection. Not humiliation in public, but restriction in private. And inside the monarchy, that distinction can be colder than any headline. Those familiar with the old rhythm of the palace know that documents like this are rarely about one person alone. But now, they are about the future shape of power. They are about who enters the room, who controls the household, who has influence after the crown passes, and who is quietly moved from the center of the royal machine to its carefully managed edge. Various interpretations suggest Charles may have framed the decision as a legacy safeguard, a way to prevent confusion before it could become conflict. But others believe it carried a sharper message. Camilla may remain honored, but the next reign will not be. Built around her circle. And that is where Prince William and Princess Anne enter the story, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the heavy silence of people who understand the crown as duty before comfort. William, the heir, has watched the monarchy survive family storms that nearly became constitutional wounds. Anne, iron-willed and unsentimental, has long been seen as the guardian of the firm's old discipline. Together, they are whispered to represent a new internal order. Cleaner lines, Anne emerged, fewer exceptions, less private softness around public power. So while the signature may have looked like a simple royal formality, those who understand palace life know better. A king's hand on paper can change more than policy. It can change destiny. And for Camilla, that destiny may now be narrowing in ways no one dared say aloud. But to understand why this signature mattered, one must return to the fragile promise that once protected Camilla's place beside the throne. Camilla's rise was never simple. It was negotiated through silence, softened by time, and sealed by public acceptance that once seemed impossible. From the shadows of scandal to the sun-drenched coronation of 2023, she had crossed a line few believed she could survive. But inside the monarchy, acceptance is not ownership. And according to Palace Whispers, that distinction has now become brutally important. For years, Camilla's place beside Charles was treated as the great royal repair job, a long and careful effort to controversy into public endurance. Nothing about it happened quickly. Every appearance, every gesture, every carefully measured role seemed designed to soften old memories and replace them with something steadier. She was no longer only the woman blamed by millions for a broken royal marriage. She became the companion who waited, the wife who stayed, the consort who understood Charles in ways others did not. And slowly, almost painfully, the palace machine began to rebuild her image. Brick by brick. Charles's loyalty was the force that held it all together. Through decades of criticism, mockery, and suspicion, he never fully stepped away from her. That loyalty became one of the defining features of his personal monarchy. To his supporters, it looked like devotion. To his critics, it looked like stubbornness. But inside royal life, it became something more powerful than either. It became policy. Camilla's acceptance was not only emotional, it was institutional. She was folded, ceremonies, charities, tours, and rituals until the public began to see not an outsider at the gates, but a woman standing at the king's side. Then came the coronation, and with it, the great symbolic victory. Camilla was no longer waiting in the margins. She was crowned. The moment carried a message that seemed impossible years earlier. The monarchy had not merely tolerated her, it had elevated her. For her allies, it felt like permanence. For Charles, perhaps it felt like the final, vindication of a life spent defending one private truth against public judgment. The crown had turned the page, or so it appeared, but monarchy is never only about appearances. It is built on layers, limits, and ancient caution. A coronation can honor a queen, but it does not automatically give her control over the next chapter. Palace tradition draws a hard line between the affection of a king and the inheritance of an institution. Charles could love Camilla, defend her, crown her, and protect her dignity, but he could not hand her the future as if it were private property. That future belongs to the crown, to the heir, and to the old machinery that survives every marriage, every scandal, every reign. That is why the reported document matters so deeply. If insiders are correct, it does not erase Camilla's status, nor does it publicly diminish the role she fought so long to reach. It does something more subtle, and possibly more painful. It honors the title while quietly limiting the authority that may surround it later. It suggests that Camilla's story, once seen as a triumph over history, may now be entering a colder phase. The phase where the monarchy thanks her, contains her, and prepares to move beyond her. What appeared to be a love story crowned in gold may now be turning into a constitutional boundary written in ink. The document itself has not been publicly released. That is what makes it so explosive. Insiders whisper of sealed instructions, household limitations, private residence clauses, and future access protocols. Not one line has been officially confirmed. Yet the palace reaction, according to those watching closely, was unmistakable. Doors closed, phones went quiet, and Camilla's circle began asking questions no one wanted to answer. Because in the royal world, the most powerful papers are often the ones the public never sees. They do not need dramatic language. They do not need threats. A clause about residence can become a quiet exile. A note about staffing can become a loss of influence. A line about funding can separate dignity from power. And if reports are accurate, this alleged document may have touched precisely those dangerous areas. Where Camilla lives, who remains around her, what household she is permitted to keep, and how much authority continues after Charles is no longer the center of the throne. That possibility alone would explain the sudden tension. Clarence House, Ray Mill House, Sandringham, Balmoral, these names are not just properties in royal life. They are symbols of belonging. To be welcomed into them is to be trusted. To have access narrowed is to feel the firm quietly closing ranks. Various interpretations suggest the document may have drawn new boundaries around future access, especially once William's reign begins. Not necessarily cruel boundaries, not necessarily public ones, but boundaries all the same. And inside a monarchy built on ceremony and control, a private restriction can land harder than a public rebuke. The institutional weight of the matter is said to have made it even more serious. Palace insiders speak in the language of red boxes, sealed memoranda, letters patent, and household instructions because those are the tools through which monarchy protects itself. A king may appear gentle in public, but the crown is not gentle on paper. It can preserve, remove, freeze, or redefine with breathtaking silence. And that is why the alleged signature has been interpreted by some as more a family decision. It may have been Charles placing the future monarchy beyond emotional negotiation. For Camilla's supporters, that would feel like a betrayal wrapped in protocol. After decades of loyalty, after years of public judgment, after reaching the throne itself, they may have expected her future to be secured with generosity. Instead, reports suggest they encountered something colder: caution. Aides were allegedly told not to discuss future arrangements. Questions were redirected. Details were buried under phrases like household continuity and long-term planning. But no one inside the royal machine needed a translation. The meaning was clear enough. Camilla's position might be respected, but her circle's reach could be reduced. And that is the part that reportedly caused the deepest unease. Once William becomes king, the monarchy will not simply change names. It will change atmosphere. The heir is believed to favor a leaner, sharper, less emotionally complicated ICO court. In that future, Camilla's faction may fear becoming ceremonial rather than central, honored rather than influential, present but no longer powerful. If Charles truly signed such a document, then he may have done the one thing no one expected from him. He may have chosen the crown's survival over the comfort of the woman he spent a lifetime defending. But if the document was merely administrative, why did it reportedly unsettle the very people who had long assumed Camilla's position was? Assas secure? Every monarchy fears one thing more than scandal: blurred bloodlines of influence. Reports suggest the true tension was not Camilla alone, but the orbit around her, the Parker Bowles connection, the private loyalties, the social networks that had grown comfortable near royal power. For years, these lines were managed politely, but now, palace whispers suggest the old guard has decided politeness is no longer enough. This is where the story becomes sharper, because no one inside the palace would openly frame it as a question of family against family. That would be too crude, too dangerous, too revealing. Instead, it would be spoken in careful phrases: access management, household clarity, future planning, constitutional distance. But beneath that polished language, the concern was brutally simple. Who gets to stand close to the crown without carrying the burden of the crown? Who benefits from royal nearness without royal duty? And who, in the next reign, will be allowed to remain? Inside the circle of influence, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, Camilla's children, are not working royals. They have not taken vows before the nation. They do not carry the public weight that falls on William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, and the others bound to the machinery of service. Yet because of their mother's position, they have inevitably become symbols of a wider anxiety. Not necessarily because of anything they have done, but because monarchy is not judged only by actions, and judged by proximity. It is judged by perception, and in the royal world, perception can become a threat before anyone has technically crossed a line. Reports suggest William's future court may be determined to make that line impossible to miss. His reign, whenever it comes, is expected by many observers to be cleaner, smaller, less tolerant of emotional exceptions and private networks. The old model, where personal relationships could blur into royal access, may no longer survive. William has seen how family drama can weaken the institution. He has seen how private grievances can become public weapons. So the reported concern around Camilla's circle is not merely social. It is strategic. It is about preventing the monarchy from becoming surrounded by people who are near power but not accountable to duty. And then there is Princess Anne, whose silence often carries more force than another royal's speech. Anne is said by many to understand the crown in its hardest form: not romance, not comfort, not a family reward, service, discipline, obligation. To someone like Anne, any hint of entitlement without sacrifice would be intolerable. The monarchy, in her view, is not a ladder for private families to climb. It is a sacred trust held for the nation, and everyone who approaches it must understand the price of entry. That is why the alleged document feels so significant. It may not strip Camilla of dignity. It may not deny her history with Charles, but it may quietly separate a public authority. It may say, in the cold language of the institution, that Camilla can be honored without allowing her wider circle to inherit influence. And that distinction could define everything that comes next. And when the old guard senses that the crown's sacred geography is being softened by private interests, one figure is said to move faster than anyone else. Princess Anne did not need to raise her voice. She rarely does. Her power has always been colder than was. That, a glance across a council table, a question buried inside protocol, a refusal to confuse sentiment with duty. Insiders suggest Anne saw the document not as cruelty, but as correction. The crown had survived centuries because someone always knew when to say. The family stops here, the institution begins there. And in that unforgiving space between blood and duty, Anne has always seemed almost untouchable. She is not the royal who begs for public warmth. She is not the figure who survives on our sympathy or soft-focus reinvention. Her authority comes from work, endurance, and a lifetime of service that has made her one of the firm's most respected internal forces. That is why, when reports suggest she supported tighter succession-era planning, the allegation carries weight. Anne does not move for gossip. She moves when she believes the crown itself needs defending. To Anne, the issue would never be whether Charles loved Camilla. Everyone knew he did. The issue was whether love, Mycia, could be allowed to bend the architecture of the monarchy after his reign. That is where the reported Iron Covenant begins to matter. Palace whispers describe it not as a single dramatic confrontation but as a discipline. A quiet doctrine of boundaries, access, staff control, residence clarity, and institutional loyalty. In simple terms, it would mean that every private comfort must answer to public duty. Every emotional exception must be measured against the future of the crown. This is why, Anne emerged, Anne's role feels so chilling. She does not need to attack Camilla to limit Camilla's circle. She does not need to humiliate anyone to insist on order. Her method is colder, cleaner, and far more effective. A household review here, a protocol question there, a reminder that royal privilege is not inherited through friendship, marriage, or convenience, but through service to the sovereign and the nation. And if Camilla's post-Charles position required definition, Anne would likely see that. Assay to the monarchy, not cruelty to the queen. Reports suggest William understood this instinct. He and Anne, different in generation but similar in discipline, are believed by some insiders to have formed a silent alignment around the future court. Not a rebellion against Charles, not a personal campaign against Camilla. Something more serious, a protective wall around the next reign. William would inherit not only palaces and ceremonies but unresolved tensions, old loyalties, private networks, and the dangerous question of who still matters once Charles is gone. Anne, with her hard-earned authority, could help make those answers clear before they became a crisis. For Charles, that realization must have been brutal. He is portrayed in these whispers as a king caught between devotion and duty, between the woman he defended for decades and the institution he was born to serve. But monarchy has never been kind to personal desire. It grants crowns, then demands sacrifices. And if Charles truly signed this document with Anne's discipline behind it, then the message was unmistakable. The crown must outlive every love story, even his own. Yet Anne's silence was only half the story. The other half belonged to William, the heir who would inherit the consequences. Prince William has spent years learning the cost of royal chaos. He has watched family disputes become global theater, private pain become public currency, and palace hesitation become weakness. So, reports emerged of Charles signing a document affecting Camilla's future. Many insiders saw William's shadow behind the logic. Not revenge, not disrespect, something colder, preparation. For William, the future is not an abstract idea. It is a pressure moving closer with every royal illness, every public controversy, every quiet briefing from the palace machine. He knows that when the crown eventually passes to him, he will not inherit a blank page. He will inherit unresolved loyalties, old bounds, private arrangements, household expectations, and people who may believe their closeness to Charles should guarantee their place beside the next king. That is the danger, not open rebellion, not scandal shouted from the steps. The danger is ambiguity, and William has seen how ambiguity can become a weapon. Reports suggest the alleged document may be designed to prevent that very problem. If Camilla's post-Charles life is clearly defined now, then William's reign begins with fewer shadows, fewer questions about where she lives, fewer uncertainties about staffing, access, funding, and ceremonial status, fewer quiet assumptions from those around her that yesterday's closeness will become tomorrow's power. This is not merely household tidiness, it is succession control. It is the firm before the family, written not in anger, but in survival instinct. Catherine's role in this future only deepens the contrast. She has spent years embodying the kind of royal discipline the Mycian emerged, institution rewards, quiet loyalty, careful restraint, and a refusal to turn private struggle into public leverage. In the palace imagination, she represents continuity without drama, dignity without demand. Against that standard, factional maneuvering looks louder, heavier, and more dangerous. William's court is expected to reflect that same discipline, less noise, fewer competing centers of influence, a monarchy that feels protected rather than crowded. And that is why Camilla's future had to, a question before it became a crisis. William cannot afford a court where emotional history complicates constitutional clarity. He cannot begin his reign negotiating old personal debts that belonged to his father's life. He cannot allow royal residences, staff privileges, family access, or public money to become blurred by sympathy or expectation. To the outside world, these may sound like cold details, Inside the monarchy, they are the bones of power. Whoever controls access controls most atmosphere. Whoever controls household structures controls influence. And whoever remains close to the sovereign can shape the story without ever holding a title. So the reported restrictions may not be about humiliating Camilla. They may be about defining her with precision, honored but not central, protected but not politically powerful, respected but not allowed to become a second court within the court. That is the hard meaning of duty over blood. It is not warm, it is not sentimental. Monarchy was never built to comfort everyone who stood near it. And if Charles understood that, then William's preparation became something even more painful. It meant the king was not merely pressured by the heir or guided by Anne's iron caution. It meant Charles may have accepted the logic himself. He may have looked at the woman he loved, the son who would follow him, and the crown that had consumed them all, and chosen the only path that protected the reign still to come. But for Allah, the cruelest part was not the document itself, it was the realization that Charles may have signed it willingly. For Queen Camilla, the signature may have felt like a door closing softly, not slamming. That is often how palace power works. No confrontation, no public humiliation. Just a memo, a clause, a revised expectation, a future quietly narrowed. Reports suggest her allies were stunned. After decades of loyalty to Charles, Camilla may now face the hardest truth of royal life. Love may crown you, but it cannot guarantee permanence. That is the tragedy at the center of this reported decision. Camilla's entire royal journey had been built on endurance. She waded through ridicule, survived public blame, absorbed years of judgment, and slowly became the woman Charles insisted the country must accept. To many of those around her, that history should have earned protection. Not just kindness, not just ceremony, security. They believed her place was no longer a question. They, Mackin, believed the coronation had settled it forever. But monarchy has a cruel memory, and it does not always reward survival with control. If palace whispers are accurate, Camilla may now find herself standing between two kinds of power. On one side is Charles's affection, personal, loyal, and deeply tied to the life they built together. On the other side is William's future authority, constitutional, disciplined, and increasingly impossible to ignore. That is a lonely place to be, because Charles may still cherish her, defend her dignity, and protect her title, while also accepting that the next reign cannot be shaped around his private emotional world. For Camilla, that would not feel like betrayal in the ordinary sense. It would feel worse. It would feel like being loved but limited. Her supporters reportedly see the move as cold, even unnecessary. They may ask why a woman who has already weathered so much should now be fenced in by clauses and protocols. Why draw lines around a queen, stood beside the king during illness, scrutiny, and national pressure? Why allow the machinery of succession to turn personal loyalty into administrative caution? These are painful questions. And yet, to the old guard, the answer is just as stark. Because the crown cannot be governed by gratitude. It cannot allow the softness of one reign to become the weakness of the next. Charles in this telling is not presented as ruthless. He is presented as weary, a king facing illness, time, inheritance, and the heavy knowledge that every unresolved matter may one day fall onto William's desk. Reports suggest this is what made the document so emotionally severe. It was not a rejection of Camilla. It was an admission that his love story could not be allowed to become William's burden. That is the moment where private devotion meets institutional survival, and the institution almost always wins. So the document becomes more than a reported arrangement. It becomes a symbol of the monarchy choosing continuity over comfort. It says that affection may be honored, but authority must be controlled. It says a queen may be cherished, but the crown must remain untangled. And for Camilla, after a lifetime spent fighting her way into the royal center, the most painful discovery may be that the center was never hers to keep. And so the palace enters a new phase, not open war, but something more dangerous. Icy peace. By dawn, nothing looked different. The flags still moved above the palace, the carriages still rolled, the courtiers still spoke in polished half-sentences. But beneath the ceremony, a new order had begun. If reports are accurate, Charles's secret signature did more than define Camilla's future. It declared that the crown would not become a family business, not even for the woman he loved most. That is why this alleged document has become more than a private royal arrangement. It is being read in the whispered language of palace watchers as a turning point in a second planning, not a scandal shouted across front pages, but a quiet act of institutional self-defense. Camilla remains queen. Her title remains intact. Her place in Charles's life cannot be erased by a clause, a file, or a future king's preference. But what may now be limited is something far more delicate. The authority surrounding her after Charles is gone, the household influence, the access, the private network, the assumption that love beside one sovereign guarantees power beside the man merged next. And that is where the monarchy reveals its oldest instinct. It absorbs emotion, then converts it into order. It takes pain, loyalty, resentment, sacrifice, and memory, and forces them through the cold machinery of continuity. Reports suggest William, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward now stand as symbols of that machinery. The heir, the enforcer, and the quiet guardian of the fine print. Together, they represent a future court built not on sentiment but discipline, not on personal debts, mine emerged, but constitutional clarity, not on who was loved most, but on what protects the crown longest. For Camilla, the outcome may feel deeply personal. For the institution, it is almost brutally impersonal. That is the contradiction at the heart of royal life. A woman can survive decades of judgment, earn public acceptance, be crowned beside the king, and still discover that the future belongs to rules older than any romance. Charles may have given her the crown in life, but he could not give her control over what comes after him. That belongs to the next reign. It belongs to the line of succession. It belongs to the sacred trust held in the name of the nation. So the moral becomes impossible to ignore. The crown is not private property. It is not a reward for loyalty, not a family inheritance to be softened by affection, not a comfort passed from one household circle to another. It is a duty, and duty has always been colder than love. That is how the monarchy survives. It separates the throne. It honors personal devotion, then locks authority behind protocol. It allows tenderness in private, but demands steel in public. And perhaps that is the final truth of Charles's reported signature. It was not simply about Camilla. It was about the monarchy after Charles, the court after sentiment, the reign after the long emotional shadow of his life. It was about William stepping closer to the burden, Anne guarding the boundaries, Edward watching the details, and Camilla facing a future that may still carry dignity, but no longer the same reach. Final ending image. A sealed document, a weakened king, a silent queen, and a crown moving toward its next guardian. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.